The airport was buzzing with life as it always did. Families hugged goodbye. Businessmen hurried with their phones in hand and children tugged at their parents' arms in excitement. In the middle of all this stood a young black woman with tired eyes and a small carry-on bag. She had been traveling for days, moving from one city to another, catching connecting flights and barely finding time to rest. The moment she stepped into the airplane, all she wanted was peace, a soft seat, and a few hours of quiet sleep away from the noise of the world. She found her seat near the window, tucked her bag under the chair and let out a long sigh of relief. The hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers settling in, and the polite smiles of the flight attendants were all too familiar to her. For a brief second she thought about her journey so far. Early mornings, long waits, the endless security checks. Now at least she was on the last leg of her trip. The thought of reaching her destination comforted her, and with that comfort came an overwhelming wave of sleep. The woman leaned her head against the window. The cool glass felt good on her skin. Outside, the runway lights glowed in the distance as the plane slowly prepared for takeoff. She pulled her thin blanket over herself, shifted in her seat to find the right position and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, and she drifted off into a deep, peaceful sleep. Around her, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of flight. A baby cried softly a few rows away before being comforted by its mother. A couple whispered about their vacation plans. The overhead compartments clicked shut as the last few passengers adjusted their bags. None of it disturbed her. Her mind had already slipped into dreams, shutting out the world around her. As the plane lifted into the night sky, the gentle vibration of the engines became like a lullaby. The woman dreamed of nothing in particular, just the kind of heavy, restful sleep that comes when exhaustion finally gives in. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm, her face calm, almost childlike. To anyone who glanced at her, she looked as if she had no worries in the world, as if the journey was just another ordinary flight. But not everyone on the plane felt that same calm. While she slept, small details were already taking shape that would later change the course of the journey. A few rows behind her, a man stared out the window with uneasy eyes, noticing the strange movement of lights far in the distance. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot exchanged quiet words, their voices low and serious. None of this reached her ears. She was far too deep in rest to sense any of it. Her dream carried her somewhere safe and warm, a place where time slowed down and worries didn't exist. Maybe she was dreaming of home, maybe of a beach she once visited, or maybe of nothing at all. What mattered was that for now she felt safe. The world of the cabin, with its restless passengers and worried crew, couldn't touch her. The minutes turned into an hour, and still she slept. The overhead lights dimmed, casting the cabin in a soft glow. The attendants moved quietly down the aisles with carts, serving drinks and snacks, lowering their voices so as not to disturb those resting. The woman shifted slightly, pulled the blanket closer, and kept sleeping, completely unaware that this quiet peace would not last forever. For her, the flight began as a calm beginning, a welcome break from the chaos of travel. She had no idea that while she slept, the plane's story was already changing. Somewhere ahead in the night sky, danger was waiting. Somewhere in the cockpit, a captain was beginning to feel fear creep into his thoughts. And somewhere in the cabin, among strangers she had never met, events were aligning that would soon wake her with a shock she could never have imagined. At that moment, though, none of it mattered. For her, there was only the steady hum of the engines, the cool window against her cheek, and the sweetness of finally letting go. The night sky outside the airplane looked endless. Stars sparkled faintly above the dark clouds, and the city lights below slowly disappeared as the plane climbed higher and higher. For most passengers, it felt like every other flight, smooth, ordinary, predictable. But beneath that calm surface, something different was starting to stir. In the cabin, the flight attendants moved about with polite smiles, but their eyes told a different story. They checked the aisles more than usual, their glances sharp and nervous. One attendant whispered quickly to another, and though her lips curved into a professional smile, her hands trembled slightly as she poured a cup of coffee. Few passengers noticed, but for those who were alert, something in the air felt uneasy, like an invisible shadow hanging over them. Near the back of the plane, a businessman adjusted his tie and frowned. He had flown countless times before, but something about the staff's behavior unsettled him. He leaned forward, pretending to stretch, and caught the tail end of a hushed conversation between two attendants. Their words were too soft to understand, but the tension in their tone was clear. Meanwhile, turbulence began to shake the cabin. At first it was light, the kind that made children giggle and nervous passengers tighten their seatbelts. But soon the jolts grew stronger. Drinks rattled on tray tables and a few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign lit up again, followed by a chime that echoed through the quiet. The black woman by the window continued to sleep peacefully, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't stir as the plane shook. To her, the turbulence blended into her dreams. But around her, whispers spread. An elderly couple prayed quietly, holding hands tightly. A teenager pulled out her phone, nervously checking if there was still Wi-Fi, as though messages from loved ones could anchor her fear. In the cockpit, the captain's face was pale under the dim glow of the control panel. His hands moved steadily over switches, but his heart raced. He glanced at the radar screen again and again, trying to make sense of the strange signals blinking back at him. The co-pilot muttered a string of calculations, his voice tight. The radar showed something unusual, a presence that should not have been there, following them too closely in the night sky. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere shifted from mild unease to restless tension. People exchanged uneasy looks, trying to read each other's expressions for clues. A mother hugged her young child a little closer. The businessman who had been listening earlier now leaned back in his seat, eyes narrowed, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. The attendants tried to mask their worry by offering reassurance. "It's just turbulence, nothing to be concerned about," one said with a strained smile. But her words felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. Passengers could sense when fear was being disguised as calm. Minutes passed slowly. Every creak of the airplane, every sudden jolt of turbulence, every hushed word between the crew seemed to feed the growing tension. The woman near the window shifted in her sleep, but remained unaware of the storm building around her. She had no idea that her quiet rest was surrounded by fear that was spreading like fire through the cabin. One man finally broke the silence. "Is everything all right?" He called out toward the attendants. His voice was shaky but loud enough to catch attention. Heads turned, eyes wide, waiting for an answer. The attendant froze for a moment, then forced a smile and nodded quickly. "Everything is under control," she said, though her eyes betrayed her, but it wasn't under control. Not completely. The captain's voice hadn't yet broken through the intercom, but the weight of his decision pressed heavily on him in the cockpit. He knew that soon he would have to say something that might change the mood of the entire flight in an instant. For now, though, the cabin remained caught in a fragile balance, fear growing silently, passengers sensing something wrong, and a young woman still asleep, blissfully unaware that her peaceful beginning was about to shatter into something far more terrifying. The cabin had fallen into a strange silence. Passengers sat stiff in their seats, some staring blankly at the seat in front of them, others pretending to read or watch the screen, but their ears stayed sharp, waiting for something, anything that would explain the uneasy atmosphere. Even the air felt heavy, as though the plane itself knew something was wrong. Then, with a sudden crackle, the intercom came alive. Every head in the cabin turned toward the ceiling. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. The captain's voice filled the air, steady at first, carrying the formal calm people expected. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." For a moment, the usual script came, the reminder about seatbelts, the reassurance that turbulence was normal. His tone tried to be casual, but passengers could hear something beneath it, something small but sharp. Fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you hear in a scream or in panic. It was the kind that hides behind calm words, leaking through in the smallest cracks. The captain paused. The silence that followed stretched far too long. A baby whimpered. Someone coughed nervously. Then came the words that shattered the thin wall of calm. "If there is any fighter pilot on board, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." The cabin froze. Passengers blinked at each other, unsure if they had heard correctly. Fighter pilot? On a passenger plane? The words didn't belong in this space of snacks, movies, and overhead reading lights. It felt surreal, like something from a film, yet the tone of the captain's voice made it clear this was no joke. Murmurs began to spread like ripples across water. "Did he say fighter pilot? What does that mean? What's happening?" Some people whispered, others spoke too loudly in panic. Confusion spilled from seat to seat, growing louder by the second. The black woman by the window stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim light. She rubbed her face, still groggy, and caught only the last echo of the announcement. The murmurs around her pulled her fully awake. She sat up straighter, pulling her blanket aside, and looked around in confusion. Something had changed. The air was thick with fear. The captain's voice returned, firmer now but shaking at the edges. "I repeat, if there is a trained fighter pilot among the passengers, please alert a member of the crew." Gasps broke out. The businessman from earlier swore under his breath. The elderly couple clutched each other even tighter, the woman whispering prayers into her husband's ear. A young mother covered her child's ears as if silence could protect him from the weight of those words. Fear was no longer just an undercurrent. It was in the open now. The passengers knew they were facing something serious. But what? Why would the captain need a fighter pilot unless there was something out there? Something that only a pilot trained for combat could understand. The woman looked at the faces around her. She saw panic, confusion, disbelief. Her own heart began to race, but she forced herself to breathe deeply. The captain wouldn't have asked unless it was necessary. She could tell by his tone that he wasn't trying to scare them. He was trying to prepare them. In the cockpit, the captain's hands gripped the microphone. He hated making the announcement, hated dragging his passengers into fear, but the blip on the radar left him no choice. The unidentified aircraft trailing them wasn't responding to signals. Its movements were too close, too deliberate. And in his heart, he knew, if things went wrong, he needed someone with combat experience, someone who could guide him through the storm that was coming. Back in the cabin, chaos slowly bubbled. Some passengers argued with attendants demanding answers. Others sat frozen, their fear locking them in place. The flight attendants tried to calm them, their voices trembling as they repeated the captain's words. "Please stay calm, remain seated. If anyone with the requested experience is on board, please approach quietly." The woman pressed her head against the cool window, her eyes scanning the endless blackness outside. She couldn't see anything unusual, only the faint glow of the wing lights. But deep inside, she felt it. The flight was no longer ordinary. Something was out there in the night, and the captain's voice had confirmed it. The silence returned again, heavier this time. Passengers waited, holding their breath to see if anyone would respond. Would someone stand up? Was there really a fighter pilot among them? The woman's hands gripped the armrest tightly as her mind spun with questions. What kind of danger was worth that call? Why had the captain sounded so afraid? She had boarded this flight expecting rest and safety, but now she felt as though she had stepped into a story far bigger, far darker, than anything she could have imagined. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. For a few seconds after the captain's words faded, the cabin was frozen in silence. People sat wide-eyed, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the plane. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to believe what they had just heard. But silence never lasts long when fear takes root. It started with a whisper. A man near the front leaned toward his wife, his voice trembling. Did he say fighter pilot? Why would he say that? She shook her head quickly, her lips pressed tight, eyes darting to the aisle as if searching for someone who could explain. The whisper grew into murmurs, and murmurs became loud voices. Soon the cabin was alive with fear. A woman clutched her child to her chest, rocking back and forth, muttering prayers under her breath. Two college students sitting together exchanged nervous jokes at first, trying to mask their terror with laughter. But their voices cracked as the reality set in. An older man slammed his hand on the armrest, demanding answers from the attendants. Tell us what's happening. We have a right to know. His voice carried across the rows, setting off more shouting. Others joined in, some angry, some crying, some too scared to move at all. The flight attendants tried desperately to calm them. Please, everyone, remain seated. Everything is under control, one of them said, her voice trembling despite her attempt at authority. But the look in her eyes betrayed the truth. Everything was not under control. The turbulence returned, shaking the cabin as if the sky itself was restless. Cups tipped, snacks rolled off trays, and passengers grabbed their armrests tightly. Gasps and screams echoed. The captain's announcement already had their nerves frayed, and now every bump in the air felt like a signal of disaster. In the middle of all this, The young black woman who had been asleep until moments ago sat upright, wide awake now. She looked around at the chaos and tried to piece together what she had missed. The words of the captain still echoed in her mind. Fighter pilot. She blinked in disbelief. This was supposed to be a simple flight. How could things have turned so strange so quickly? She reached for her phone, instinctively checking for signal. But the Wi-Fi was down. Even if she could message someone, what would she say? That the captain had asked for a fighter pilot on board? Who would believe her? The aisles filled with noise. Some passengers tried to stand, only to be ordered back into their seats. One young man paced near the lavatory, his hands in his hair, muttering about hijackings and military jets. His panic only fed the fear around him. A child began to wail, his cries piercing through the chaos. His mother hushed him, but her own tears ran down her face. The sound of crying spread, with grown men and women now joining in, unable to hide their terror. The woman by the window felt her chest tighten. Fear wanted to take over, but she forced herself to focus. She studied the attendants. Their faces were pale, their smiles shaky, but they were not panicking like the passengers. That meant they knew something, but also that they were afraid to say it. Another jolt of turbulence sent a suitcase tumbling from the overhead bin, crashing onto the aisle. People screamed. A man jumped to his feet and shouted, "We're going to die." His words hung in the air like poison, making the panic even worse. The attendants rushed to control him, guiding him back to his seat, but his outburst had already spread fear like wildfire. Conversations grew louder, overlapping, some demanding answers, others begging for calm. The cabin had turned into a storm of its own, and it felt as though the walls of the plane were closing in. Then came a sudden silence, sharper than before. It wasn't caused by calm, it was caused by expectation. Every passenger's eyes turned toward the aisles, waiting. Would someone stand? Was there really a fighter pilot among them? Could anyone answer the captain's call? Seconds stretched like hours. No one moved. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the faces around her. She half expected someone to rise dramatically, but the silence continued, and with it came a terrible thought. Maybe no one on this flight could help. The captain hadn't explained the danger, but he didn't need to. Everyone now understood that something was out there, something serious enough to terrify an experienced pilot. And here they were, trapped in a metal tube thousands of feet in the sky, powerless and afraid. The black woman clenched her fists. Fear was contagious, but so was courage. She whispered to herself, "Stay calm."
Just stay calm.
She didn't know what was coming, but she knew one thing. Panic wouldn't save them. Around her, though, the cabin was slipping further into chaos. The fragile line between fear and hysteria had been crossed, and the passengers could only wait for the next announcement, the next piece of truth that would either calm their hearts or shatter them completely, and the captain's voice had not yet finished its story. The cabin buzzed with fear, but what the passengers didn't know was that the real danger wasn't inside the plane. It was outside, hidden in the darkness of the night sky. In the cockpit, the captain's hand hovered over the controls, his eyes locked on the radar screen. The small green dots blinked steadily, but one dot stood out, an intruder moving too close, far too close. It wasn't responding to any signals. No radio communication, no acknowledgement. Just a silent shadow tracking their every move. He exchanged a glance with the co-pilot. Both men knew the risks. An unidentified aircraft at this altitude, this close to a passenger plane, was no accident. It could be a malfunctioning private jet, a reckless pilot ignoring rules, or something far worse. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the passengers could sense the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Some whispered that it must be terrorists. Others guessed it was a military exercise gone wrong. A few even thought of hijackings, though no one dared say it too loudly. Everyone knew one thing for certain. The captain would not have asked for a fighter pilot unless the threat was real. The black woman, now fully awake, pressed her forehead against the window, squinting into the dark. At first, she saw nothing but endless black sky and faint stars. Then, just for a second, a flash like a light reflecting off metal. Her breath caught in her throat. She blinked, trying to be sure, and there it was again. A faint silhouette flying too close to their wing, its outline barely visible against the night. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't her imagination. Something was there. She turned quickly, but the people beside her were too lost in their own panic to notice. She wanted to say something, to point it out, but fear held her tongue. If she was wrong, she'd only add to the chaos. If she was right, then the danger was worse than anyone imagined. In the rows ahead, the murmurs grew louder. A man whispered, "It's a fighter jet. I saw it through the window." His words spread quickly, passed from mouth to mouth until the rumor became truth in the minds of the passengers. Panic rose again, like waves crashing against the fragile calm the crew tried to maintain. The attendants moved down the aisles, their voices low but firm, urging people to stay seated. But their hands shook as they handed out water, and their eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit door. They knew what the passengers didn't. The captain had already tried to contact the unidentified aircraft, and there had been no reply. Back in the cockpit, the silence on the radio was deafening. The captain tapped the mic again, his voice controlled but desperate. "Unidentified aircraft at 12 o'clock. This is Flight 228. Respond immediately." Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The green blip stayed locked on the radar, steady as a predator stalking its prey. The captain's chest tightened. If it made one wrong move, a collision at this speed could destroy them all. In the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with fear. Every passenger seemed to hold their breath at once. Some prayed, some cried silently. Others stared out the windows, desperate to see what was happening. The woman gripped her armrest, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. She couldn't stop replaying the captain's words in her mind. Fighter pilot on board. Why? Why would he ask that unless he believed their lives depended on it? A new wave of turbulence struck stronger than before. Trays clattered, bags shifted, and a few passengers screamed. The plane dipped suddenly, and the cabin filled with terrified cries. For a moment, it felt like the sky itself was unraveling. The captain steadied the plane quickly, but the damage was done. Fear had consumed the passengers. A woman fainted in her seat, her husband frantically shaking her shoulders. Two men argued loudly in the aisle, accusing the crew of hiding the truth. A child sobbed uncontrollably as his mother whispered reassurances she herself didn't believe. The black woman kept her eyes fixed on the window. She saw the silhouette again, closer this time, gliding silently alongside the plane. Her breath caught. There was no denying it now. Something was out there, and it wasn't going away. The hidden threat was no longer hidden. It was real, it was near, and it was watching them. And somewhere inside that shadow, whoever or whatever was piloting it had not yet shown their intentions. The passengers waited in dread for the next announcement, the one that would either give them hope or confirm their worst fears. The cabin was drowning in fear. People clung to their seats, their whispers now louder than the hum of the engines. Some prayed with closed eyes, some cursed under their breath. Others simply stared blankly into space, too shocked to react. The captain's request still echoed in their minds, louder than the turbulence outside. "Any fighter pilot on board?" For long minutes, no one had moved. Every passenger looked at every other passenger, hoping someone, anyone, would stand up. But no one did. The silence stretched unbearably, feeding the terror. It felt as though the plane itself was holding its breath. And then, just when hope seemed to vanish, a hand slowly rose. It belonged to an older man sitting near the middle rows. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture strong but modest. He wasn't the type who demanded attention. In fact, he had sat quietly during the chaos, saying nothing while panic spread around him. Now his calm face turned toward the nearest flight attendant, and with a steady voice he said, "I was a fighter pilot." The words cut through the noise like lightning. The cabin fell instantly silent, every eye snapping toward him. For a moment, people simply stared, unable to process what they had just heard. Then gasps rippled through the rows. Relief and disbelief mingled in the air. The flight attendant blinked, frozen for a second before leaning down. "Sir, are you serious?" Her voice shook with equal parts hope and fear. He nodded slowly. "Retired. 20 years in service, U.S. Air Force." The passengers erupted. Some clapped weakly as if they'd been waiting for a hero to appear. Others whispered frantically, still unsure if one man could change their fate. A woman whispered to her husband, "Thank God, someone knows what to do." The black woman by the window sat upright, staring at him. Her heart raced, not from fear this time, but from awe. He looked so ordinary at first glance, just another passenger blending into the crowd. But now, in this moment, he was something more. He was a lifeline. The attendant hurried down the aisle, motioning him to follow. He stood up slowly, his tall frame steady, and moved toward the front. Passengers leaned out of their seats to watch, some reaching out to touch his arm as if his presence alone could anchor them. He gave a polite nod here and there, but kept his focus on the cockpit door. As he passed, the black woman caught his eye for just a brief second. His look was calm but serious, filled with unspoken determination. It sent a shiver through her. He wasn't afraid, not in the way the rest of them were. He carried himself like a man who had seen fear before and had learned how to master it. When he reached the front, the attendants quickly led him to the cockpit. The door opened slightly, revealing a flash of glowing panels, the captain's tense face, the co-pilot's trembling hands. Then the door closed again, shutting the rest of the passengers out. The cabin exploded with noise. "Is he really a fighter pilot?" one man demanded. "Of course he is. Why would he lie?" Another replied. "Will he fly the plane?" "Is that what's happening?" someone else asked, half panicked, half hopeful. The uncertainty spread again, but this time it was tempered with something new, fragile hope. Inside the cockpit, the retired pilot introduced himself firmly, his voice carrying authority. He explained his experience, the missions he had flown, the dangers he had faced in the past. The captain listened intently, relief washing over his face. Finally, there was someone who understood what they were up against, someone who had been trained to handle threats like the one outside their window. The retired pilot studied the radar carefully. His eyes narrowed at the blip that had stalked them since takeoff. He asked quick, precise questions. How long had it been trailing? At what distance? Had it made any aggressive movements? The co-pilot answered shakily, and the man absorbed every detail, his face unreadable. Back in the cabin, time dragged. The passengers waited anxiously, straining to hear anything through the closed door. Some whispered prayers of gratitude, others argued about what the captain should do next. But through all of it, one truth remained. Someone had finally stepped forward. The black woman pressed her hands together, whispering softly under her breath. She didn't even realize she was smiling slightly for the first time since she woke. It wasn't much, but it was something, a flicker of light in the storm. The surprising revelation had changed everything. The threat was still out there, silent and menacing in the dark sky. The danger hadn't passed, but now they were not entirely helpless. For the first time since the nightmare began, the passengers had someone to believe in. And as the retired fighter pilot settled into the cockpit, his steady voice began to cut through the captain's fear, offering guidance, strategy, and experience. The hidden shadow outside still loomed, but inside the plane, a quiet strength had entered the fight. The cabin felt like a room filled with ticking clocks. Every second dragged painfully, every sound magnified. The hum of the engines, the rattling of trays, the shallow breaths of terrified passengers. People tried to distract themselves, some closing their eyes, some whispering to neighbors, but nothing could block out the reality. A silent enemy was out there just beyond the windows, and no one knew what it wanted. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was even heavier. The captain's shoulders were stiff, his hands clenching the controls as though they might slip from his grasp. Sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool air conditioning. The co-pilot flipped through screens nervously, his fingers fumbling on buttons he had pressed 1,000 times before. Fear had crept into both men, and it showed. Then came the steady voice of the retired fighter pilot. Calm, controlled. A voice that seemed unshaken by the chaos outside. "Breathe first," he told the captain, his tone firm but not unkind. "Fear clouds judgment. We can't afford that." The captain inhaled sharply, then nodded. The fighter pilot leaned closer to the radar, studying the glowing dot that followed their path. It moved with uncanny precision, matching the plane's altitude and speed. Whoever was inside that aircraft wasn't flying by accident. They were watching, waiting, maybe even testing. He asked for binoculars. One of the attendants brought them quickly. He pressed them against the cockpit window, scanning the darkness. For a long moment he was silent. Then he muttered, "It's a jet, no doubt. Military design. Too close for comfort." The captain swallowed hard. What did they want? The older man didn't answer immediately. He had seen this kind of maneuver before in his years of service. Shadow flights, intimidation tactics, tests of nerve. Sometimes they ended quietly. Sometimes they didn't. Back in the cabin, the black woman kept her eyes glued to the window. She thought she saw a shape again. a faint outline sliding through the darkness like a predator stalking prey. Her chest tightened, but she refused to look away. If she was going to be afraid, she wanted to stare fear in the face. Passengers were unraveling quickly. A man paced the aisle despite being told to sit down, muttering about missiles and attacks. Two women cried openly, their sobs filling the air. A young boy asked his father, "Are we going to crash?" The father, his own lips trembling, forced a smile and whispered, "No, son, we'll be okay." But his eyes betrayed him. The attendants moved tirelessly, trying to calm them. One knelt beside a fainted woman, fanning her with a magazine. Another reassured the elderly couple who clutched rosaries in their shaking hands. Their voices were soft but cracked with strain. They were professionals, but they were human too. The retired pilot, meanwhile, was guiding the crew like a commander on a battlefield. He explained how to adjust altitude slightly without provoking the shadow jet, how to signal with lights in a way that might test response, how to keep the cabin informed without fueling hysteria. His tone carried authority, the kind that came from years of life or death experience. "This isn't about panic," he told the captain. "It's about who blinks first." The captain nodded grimly. He understood. This wasn't just flying anymore, it was a battle of nerves. The passengers, though, didn't see the strategy. All they felt was the weight of the unknown. The woman by the window noticed the change in the plane's movement, subtle but noticeable. Her stomach dipped slightly as the altitude shifted. Whispers grew again. "Why are we moving? What are they doing now?" Then suddenly a streak of light flashed outside the window. Gas filled the cabin. For a heartbeat, people thought it was a missile, a strike, the end. But it wasn't. It was just the other jet adjusting its position, its lights reflecting briefly against the clouds. Still, the sight shook everyone to the core. The woman gripped her seat tightly, her nails digging into the fabric. The man beside her crossed himself repeatedly, whispering prayers. The fear was suffocating, yet no one could escape it. Inside the cockpit, the retired pilot remained calm. He explained each move to the captain, breaking down the enemy's behavior like a chess match. "They're testing us, watching how we react. If we panic, they'll press harder. If we stay steady, they might back off." The captain exhaled, his hand steadier now under the older man's guidance. Together they made tiny adjustments, careful not to provoke but refusing to cower. Every move was deliberate, every second calculated. It was a duel of patience, of control, of courage. The shadow jet outside had its power, its speed, its intimidation. But inside this cabin, one man's calm presence was slowly turning fear into focus. The passengers didn't know the details, but they felt the shift. Something in the air had changed. The attendant seemed a little steadier. The captain's voice, when it finally came again over the intercom, was firmer. "Ladies and gentlemen, remain calm. We are managing the situation." The words weren't much, but they were enough. Enough to remind the passengers that not all hope was lost. The battle of nerves wasn't over. The shadow still lingered outside, its intentions hidden. But for the first time, the plane wasn't just drifting helplessly. It was fighting back, quietly, with composure and willpower. And deep down, the black woman realized something. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, steadily, guiding others through the storm. The cabin was a world suspended between fear and hope. Hours seemed to pass in minutes, minutes stretched into hours. Every passenger sat frozen, waiting for the unseen threat outside to make its next move. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside the plane, hearts pounded like drums. The retired fighter pilot leaned close to the captain, his eyes sharp on the radar. The shadow jet still lingered. It moved when they moved, slowed when they slowed, climbed when they climbed. It was like a ghost refusing to leave. "Hold steady," the older man said calmly. "They're waiting for us to break. Don't give them that satisfaction." The captain nodded, his breathing heavy but more controlled now. The co-pilot followed orders with careful precision, his earlier panic replaced by grim focus. In the tight space of the cockpit, 3 men carried the weight of hundreds of lives. Then suddenly, the green blip shifted. The unknown jet pulled closer, far too close. Its lights flashed once, then twice. Gasps filled the cockpit. "Is that a warning?" the co-pilot asked, his voice tight. The retired pilot narrowed his eyes. "No, it's a decision." Back in the cabin, the black woman pressed her face to the glass. She saw it now, clearer than ever. The shadow jet, sleek and metallic, sliding alongside their wing like a predator circling prey. Its lights blinked eerie in the darkness. Around her, passengers screamed, some ducking their heads, others clutching each other as if bracing for impact. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. The plane shook with turbulence, trays rattled, and a suitcase fell with a thud. Children cried, adults shouted, and chaos filled the cabin once again. Then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow broke away. The unidentified jet veered sharply to the right, its engines roaring in the distance. In seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the endless black of the sky. For a moment, no one dared believe it. The cabin stayed silent, as if everyone was afraid that speaking might bring it back. Then whispers rose. "It's gone. It left. Did you see? It's gone." The relief hit like a wave. Passengers began crying, not from fear this time, but from the sudden release of it. Some laughed shakily, others hugged strangers, and prayers of gratitude filled the air. The tension that had gripped them for so long loosened all at once, leaving behind exhaustion and tears. The black woman leaned back in her seat, her chest heaving. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the relief wash over her. She thought of how the flight had begun, with her drifting into peaceful sleep, and how she had woken into a nightmare. Now, with the threat gone, she realized just how close they had come to disaster, and how fragile life truly was. Inside the cockpit, the retired pilot finally allowed himself a deep breath. His steady hand patted the captain's shoulder. "You did well," he said. The captain, still pale but calmer, managed a weak smile. "We couldn't have done it without you," the co-pilot added softly. "You saved us." The older man shook his head. "I didn't save you. We held steady together. That's what mattered." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. When he stepped back into the cabin, passengers erupted in applause. Some stood clapping through tears, others called out words of thanks. The attendants smiled through their own trembling relief, bowing their heads in respect. The black woman watched him as he walked past her row. She didn't clap or cheer. She simply stared at him with quiet gratitude. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she gave him a small nod as if to say, "You reminded us what courage looks like." He returned the nod with the faintest smile before sitting down again, blending back into the crowd as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The rest of the flight passed in fragile quiet. People spoke in hushed voices, comforted children, and finally allowed themselves to relax. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steadier this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation has been resolved. We are safe, and we will continue to our destination. Thank you for your patience and trust." When the plane finally touched down hours later, the passengers applauded again, but this time with the joy of survival. They had faced terror in the skies and lived to tell the story. The black woman walked off the plane with shaky legs, the cool night air greeting her like a blessing. She glanced back once, watching the retired pilot disappear into the crowd of travelers. No fanfare, no spotlight, just an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary secret of courage. She knew she would never forget that night. Not the captain's trembling words, not the panic that swept the cabin, not the shadow in the sky. But more than anything, she would remember the lesson hidden in the chaos. That bravery is not the absence of fear, but the will to stand steady in its face, and in that moment, she understood, sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. Sometimes they sit quietly in the row behind you, waiting for the moment when the world needs them most.